सर खैरियत सर?
ठीक है।
So we are going live on YouTube.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
अस्सलाम।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम।
सर
अरे क्या बात है भाई, इतने दिनों बाद देख रहे हैं, गाल वाल फूल गए हैं, बिल्कुल ही लाल लाल हो गए हैं।
ज़ईफ़ी
ये तो मुझे
का हाल है।
ये तो मुझे ज़ईफ़ ही नहीं दिख रहे थे, जवानी दिख रही है।
अच्छा की सजा।
अब तो पहले से ज्यादा जवान लग रहे हैं।
अच्छा पहले शायद बच्चा होता था मैं पहले कूदकी में था।
कुछ
अब मैच्योर हुए हैं। अरे हाँ,
कुछ लोगों पे जवानी बाद में आती है।
इस साल को
एक आप हैं जो एवरग्रीन है, अजहर भाई।
11:05 में हम शुरू कर देंगे, 2 मिनट और है।
2 मिनट है।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम व रहमतुल्लाह।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर।
हमारे डीन साहब मौजूद हैं, सर सलाम अर्ज कर रहे हैं।
जी मैंने उनको सलाम किया।
जी
वालेकुम अस्सलाम। जी आप आवाज सुन रहे हैं मेरी?
जी जी
तरस गया था सर।
माशाअल्लाह, लाल लाल हो रहे हैं कुतुबुद्दीन साहब।
बाहर है उस तरफ।
मैं भी लाल पहना हूँ।
ये सब छोड़ो, बहुत सारे लोग बैठे हैं वहां पर, आपकी आवाज सुनना चाहते हैं, उन्हें भी सलाम कीजिए आप।
किनके सर? खुर्शीद इमाम साहब की। आज सूफियों का दिन है सर, इमामों का नहीं।
यही तो है प्रॉब्लम, सारा प्रॉब्लम यही है।
ठीक है, शुरू करते हैं।
हाँ बिस्मिल्लाह कीजिए रिजवान साहब।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू and good morning to all of you. This is my honor to welcome you all to the 7th Shah Waliullah Memorial Lecture organized by the Center of Arabic and African Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Actually, this lecture series was started by Professor Bashir Ahmed Jamali, who used to be our teacher and now retired from the services of the university. So this is the 7th year of the lecture, which we were supposed to organize in the month of March, but due to lockdown, we had to defer. So because it is lockdown, so we are organizing it online through Zoom. On behalf of the center, I welcome you all to the lecture to be delivered by Professor Raziuddin Aquil of Delhi University. And the topic of the lecture is Love for God and Service to Humanity, Islam and Ambiguity in Sufi Traditions of Medieval and Early India. So the session will be chaired by Professor Syed Anul Hassan, Dean, School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies. I thank him for agreeing to chair the session despite his busy schedule today, because he must be having so many other engagements. I welcome all the participants who are joining from other places outside JNU. I welcome my students, my colleagues, my research scholars who have already joined and who will be joining very soon. So before we invite Professor Raziuddin Aquil to deliver the lecture, may I request Dr. Khurshid Imam to introduce the honorable speaker, Dr. Khurshid Imam.
Thank you, sir. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasant day in Delhi. People would be joined from different parts of the country. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Raziuddin Aquil Sahab, who would be delivering the 7th Shah Waliullah Memorial Lecture on the topic Love for God and Services to Humanity, Islam and Ambiguity in Sufi Traditions of Medieval and Early Modern India. Professor Raziuddin is associated with the Department of History in the University of Delhi for over a decade now. Following his association with the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Professor Raziuddin accomplished his higher education from 2 central universities located in Delhi. His master's from Jamia Millia Islamia, which is celebrating its 100th year of establishment, and his MPhil and PhD from JNU, which is celebrating its 50th year of establishment. It is just unfortunate, sir, that we are deprived of your physical presence in your alma mater due to the pandemic. Nevertheless, we are excited to listen to your lecture. Who would be a better person than you to lecture on the topic Love for God and Services to Humanity? For you have worked intensively and extensively on the subject for most part of your academic life. Professor Raziuddin Aquil has extensively studied and worked on Sufism, Sufis, Islam, and Muslims. He has lectured and published books and articles exploring various aspects of these themes, adding immensely to the basket of knowledge on Sufism, Sufi traditions, particularly centering around India in different periods of Indian history. His latest book was published this year itself on Days in the Life of Sufi, 101 Enchanting Stories of Wisdom. It was published this year when the world was locked down he was busy completing his book, which came out through Pan Macmillan publications. Most of his publications have been from very reputed establishments, including Oxford, Macmillan, etc. His another book, he has almost like 10 books to his credit, and theming around the same topics, which have been extensively reviewed and credited for the immense contributions he has made. An Earthly Paradise, Trade, Politics, and Culture in Early Modern Bengal, which he has co-edited with Tilottama Mukherjee. And another book which he has published is The Muslim Question, Understanding Islam and Indian History. Now, these are the topics which has interested us, which has intrigued us, and we at the Center of Arabic in School of Languages have been working on several of related themes in our centers, where we have students who have a very strong academic background with Islamic knowledge, and their exposure at JNU, which you are quite familiar with, sir, about their exposure in JNU with different ideas and philosophies, have worked very intensively also on similar topics. So these themes are very intriguing for us as well, and we are very excited and looking forward to listen to you. I'm just naming few of his publications so that we get an idea of the vast knowledge he has, and I think nobody else would be a better person to speak on the topic, which is very relevant and concerning each one of us. His another book, Lovers of God, Sufism and the Politics of Islam in Medieval India, which is another very intriguing thing, because in our contemporary times, similar themes have been discussed day in and day out in different media. So, sir, we from the Center of Arabic and African Studies welcome you. And this is just, I'm not talking about the journals and articles he has published, which is of diverse nature. Music, for example, he has an article on music in Chishti Sufism, culture of immaturity and other propositions, aspects of Mughal history in the period of decline. So ups and downs of history and how it has impacted the Muslim society in India, and how Sufism has influenced the society is an important area of his studies, which he would be sharing with us today. So I stop myself because he has such a vast literature subject of publications which he has contributed, that it would require a long session to introduce his articles and publications and the themes he has touched upon regarding Sufism in India. So I stop myself and open and ask the chair of the session to take it forward. Thank you, sir, and we welcome you once again.
So now I invite Professor Raziuddin Aquil to deliver his lecture.
Good morning, salam, and namaste to all the participants. And I must begin by thanking Rizwan Sahib for actually persuading me to speak in these conditions. And thanks to Professor Hassan, and thank you very much to Dr. Imam for your kind, generous introduction. I have been a quintessential JNU person, actually, even if I have been in Calcutta and Delhi University, Jamia, other places. So I take this opportunity to also thank my professors at the Center for Historical Studies in JNU for making us what we have become, no matter how naqis we might be in our presentations and conduct perhaps at times. I should also like to thank my long-standing friends, Professor Mujibur Rahman from our days of innocence in Jamia, and also Professor Mazhar Mahdi, who has been kind of a very graceful pillar of support to which we keep turning to. He is also something of a Sufi in the sense that Sufis were like lampposts, showing light to people, disciples, followers to move in whatever direction they can move to. But as it would happen, the followers hold on to the lamppost and stop moving. But he has been guiding us to keep exploring wherever there are possibilities of our intellectual growth and our credentials and characters, akhlaq and adab and norms on how to conduct in ourselves in the worst of times. It is also indeed a great, and thank you also to Professor Hassan for being here, and I'm grateful for that. It is indeed a great honor for me to have been invited for this distinguished lecture series. It must be my first lecture of this kind that where in all my humbleness and modesty, I think no one has invited me for a lecture of this kind. So there might be some nerves, but Sufism is a field on which I have been working for a long time now, and working not so much as a follower of Sufism, but as a scholar of Sufism, as a historian of Sufism, with all the criticality that is required in the writing of history. So with reference to historical evidence and facts and interpretations, grounded in the literature. Sometimes literature of the Sufis themselves, sometimes in terms of method and practice of the historians, which takes care of ensuring that the historian does not become a devotee of the Sufi tradition or traditions themselves. This is also important in terms of the both the topic of the lecture and the series, Shah Waliullah Memorial Lecture. The foremost saint and scholar of Delhi in the 18th century. Shah Waliullah remains one of the most respected figures in most forms of Islam in the subcontinent. No matter what kind of maslak and sects and firqas people might get divided, Shah Waliullah is an important figure. Is a Naqshbandi saint, a scholar, Sufi, eminent figure who intervenes politically when it is required, who intervenes intellectually when that intellectual apparatus needed to be uplifted and move with time. And therefore, all these interventions of political kind, intellectual kind, and spiritual kind are so very important in the 18th century, and not only in the 18th century, but subsequently 19th and 20th century. He was an eclectic reformist, and intervened politically when needed, as in the case of the Maratha, Mughal Maratha Abdali difficulties in the latter half of the 18th century. He would also be translating Quran into Persian in view of the fact that a large majority of Indian Muslims do not know Arabic enough for them to be able to understand what is being taught in the Quran, or what are they reading when they are reciting the Quran. So I was in a lighter vein, I was speaking to Professor Mujib and telling them that, as someone beginning my life as in a Muslim family, I might have read the whole fact Quran 1001 times without understanding a single verse of it properly. So what is the point in such recitations? So therefore, Quran should be made available in Persian, or Quran should also be made available in Hindi and Urdu, which Shah Waliullah's son, Shah Raziuddin and Sheikh Abdul Qadir did by translating Quran in Thet Hindi, written in Persian script. So these are very, very important figures and their interventions, both in terms of Sufi practices and all the innovations, etc., which have crept in, and yet their location in the foundational categories of Islam, of traditions of the Prophet and Quran and early exemplars, etc., are very, very important, and continues to remind us in terms of how as Muslims, despite all the deviations, they are supposed to be bound to the foundational categories of Islam. But what I'm going to say today, much of it would not have been approved by Shah Waliullah, because many of the practices of the Sufis and Sufi centers and dargahs, etc., were beginning to be questioned already from the very early times in terms of the custodians of Islam. Say in our case, in North Indian case, from very early period, Sunni Hanafi variety of Islam, creating yardsticks, and through which they were judging other forms of and practices, etc. So as I said, much of what I'm going to speak today may not have been approved by Shah Waliullah, especially on concerns regarding contested practices in Sufi fraternities in India historically, especially with regard to which I will come back, the practices of the dargahs. But some of these practices are part of the popular domain on which there can be no or little control. So in some sense, it will be umume balwa kind of situation where you just can't handle the crowd and let the people do whatever they want to in terms of some semblance of permissibility, that it is allowed perhaps in such situations. But the exemplars, whether Sheikh Ali Hujwari in the 11th century, who wrote his Kashful Mahjub, or Moinuddin Chishti in the 12th, 13th century, Nizamuddin Auliya, 13th, 14th century, Baba Farid before him, and a whole lot of scholars and writers. Sheikh Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlevi in the 16th century and early 17th century is a foremost scholar of the traditions of the Prophet. He is also a Sufi, and he's writing Tazkiras, Sufi Tazkiras. Akbarul Akhyar is one of the most reliable, authentic kind of biographies of Sufis of the Sultanate period. And we also have very, very important figures like Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi, as also Shah Waliullah in the 18th century. The controversial practices and about which there are lots of contestations include: one, visits to dargahs and khanqahs in large numbers of women and non-Muslims, and their modes of prayers. This is the controversy, that so many women and so many non-Muslims are coming. They are bringing their practices and making it Hinduana in the Hindu case, and women coming to dargahs are a matter of khatra. So therefore prostration there, or offering rituals of Sufi chadar there, or burning incense, agarbatti there. These are the practices, and seeking blessings and benediction there would be perceived as something which is not approved of in Islam. These are innovations. These are maybe bidat or shirk, etc. Would be the allegations leveled against these practices. Whereas roza, namaz, hajj, zakat, these are the foundational practices. These should suffice in normal times. But beyond that, people are coming to remember, women are not being often allowed to go to mosque. Women are not being allowed to go to Pakistan. They were not supposed to go to visit dargahs also. Where will women go? And who are we to stop? Would be the question. The other contested practice is, which is my second point, is of Sufi music, qawwali, surur and raqs and singing and dancing, and they could be wild, and they could be very, very aesthetically performed, practiced over a long period of time, to which I will come back. What kind of music is halal? What kind of music is haram? What kind of music is makruh? What kind of music is mubah? Would be, and there are adab sama, and therefore sahib sama would be knowing how to conduct themselves in the mahfil sama or in qawwali, whether musical instruments are allowed or not, whether women are allowed or not, and in what condition dancing in wajd and sarur is allowed. The third set of issues are with regard to adoption by Sufis themselves of non-Muslim practices, of different kinds wherever they went. In our context, in North Indian context, generally in the subcontinental context, the appropriation and adoption of yogic exercises of different kinds, whether it is pranayama or more spectacular thing called chillai makus. It was also referred to as salate makus and namaz makus. Certainly this would alert and alarm the custodians of Islam in terms of what kind of a salam and salat or namaz it is, and it is spectacular, picked up from the sadhus. Simon Digby would say that Simon Digby is a historian of the Chishti tradition, especially would say that this is actually picked up from a certain sect of the sadhus, urdhmukhi sadhus, who would do samadhi standing on their head, upside down. And the Sufis, Baba Farid and others would pick it up to make it more spectacular in the sense that they would, get their legs, tied with a rope and then hang themselves upside down with a branch of a tree. And that branch of a tree is overlooking a mosque courtyard, and there is a well there. And this practice is performed in the middle of the night for 40 nights. And then the extraordinary claims that will be made and that will become objectionable is that this was suggested by Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, who is buried here in Mehrauli, to Baba Farid, that chille makus karo, do chille makus. And then it would be suggested that Sheikh Abu Sa'id Abul Khair had done it in Herat. And before that, Prophet Muhammad had also practiced chille makus, which is a very, very doubtful kind of claim that is being made in this case. So many practices of the Sufis themselves, which were beyond the ritual prayers of namaz and roza, hajj, zakat, were contested and were doubted in terms of what kind of Islam these people are practicing. But they were also, fasting, on month's end, and they were into, night vigils. They would be, they would also, engage themselves in different kinds of zikr and awrad, etc., which was beyond, which did not mean that Sufis were completely, had completely renounced themselves, renounced, dunya, and they had become completely ascetic of the Hindu ascetic kind. They were not. They were very much also concerned about matters this worldly, and yet, it would not be materialistic, but it would be about spiritual welfare of the people around them. And they would do this in different ways, through miraculous interventions, for instance, karamat. And it is for karamat only that people go to visit the Sufis and dargahs, etc. Someone is seeking blessings and benedictions for different kinds of purpose. So beliefs in miracles of Sufis is an important practice, and which is also a controversial matter of controversy. In certain traditions, the prophetic miracles, mu'ajjazat, are supposed to be valid, but Sufi miracles, karamat, are not supposed to be valid. Now, Nizamuddin Aulia's position on this would be that, just as prophets have the power to perform miracles, which they must display, mu'ajjazat, to establish their credentials, Sufis also get powers to perform miracles in view of their association with God, and yet their karamat is to be hidden. Karamat can only be used from, in exceptional situation to do something good, for the general public weal. Sufis would also recognize that even yogis, and other non-Muslim mystics could also perform miracles of certain kind, of a lower kind, perhaps, not mu'ajjazat, not karamat, but istidraj, would be the suggestion. And then there will be some magical tricks called maunat. So mu'ajjazat, karamat, istidraj, maunat. These would be the order in which miracles are possible. The other objection is with regard to the blind conformity in Piri-Muridi relationship, which is the argument. I was saying that this Sufis were like lampposts. People should be walking away in the light shown by the lamppost, but some people are holding on to the lamppost, and which is the Piri-Muridi relationship. But the argument is that if a Pir claims that a certain person is a Murid, but that Murid is denying that he or she has no attachment with the Pir, the Murid's position is authoritative. Unless a Murid claims that he or she is a disciple of such and such Pir, that Pir's claim of being Pir will not be recognized. So Pir is not important in this relationship on her own. And yet, in extraordinary situation, the Pir will command such respect that whatever statements the Pir would be making, the Murid has to accept without questioning. And an exceptional example I've come across is with regard to the usual formula in Islam with regard to the foundational belief of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. If a Sufi says La ilaha illallah Shibli Rasulullah, the Murid has to accept that and follow the advice. If the Murid does not agree, that person will not remain Murid. The next set of issues are with regard to healing powers of ganda and taweez and charms and amulets, for which people go to mazars and dargahs. They also go to Sufi, to mosque, in evenings, seeking some jharpuk, blowing and touching, as also ganda taweez, and for which large crowds are to be seen historically congregating at these places to Pirs and Khajas and Sufis and Sheikhs, to Imams in mosque. And this is understandable, given the fact that medical infrastructure collapses in the best of times. So where will the poor people go? Poor people will go to khanqahs and jamaat khanas and dargahs and hospices, mosques, in such mosques where jharpuk is allowed. The other set of issues are with regard to belief that Sufi saints never die. Sufi saints never die. They lay buried in their graves, and that's how the spiritual barakah of the presence of the Sufi who is near to God is publicized. The spirituality of a particular place is attached to the fact that the grave, has the body of the person of the Sufi, lying there and taking care of the world around him, and therefore the continuous blessings and benediction is possible. This is a controversial position, but this is how it works. The spiritually soaked atmosphere of a particular dargah or mazar is precisely because people visiting there believe that the person who is lying buried there knows that such and such person has come for supplication, dua, and seeking blessings and benediction. I mentioned about the idea of tark-e-dunya previously. Renunciation is a different kind of renunciation. It is not, it is not that you wear a langota and go away to jungle and sit there in isolation and do meditation of your yoga and other exercises, etc. But the tark-e-dunya means to live in the world and endure all the hardships of the world in the service of the humanity, And therefore, as I said in the title, the service to the humanity is central to the love of God, and without that, no amount of prayers, etc., are going to be enough. And therefore, the notion of lovers and friends of God, Waliullah. And in Nizamuddin Awliya's case, other way around, Mahbub Ilahi was a beloved of God. And there will be questions raised about these notions, but these are the practices central to Sufism. Sufis style themselves as lovers and friends of God, and they have devoted their life in their love for God. And that love for God is not in terms of any kind of sexual terms, but it is a matter of heart. It is a matter of spirit, and it is a matter of the vision, of satisfaction of the vision of God. And this takes us to this controversy with regard to possible distinction between Tawheed and Wahdatul Wujud, and there are huge debate about these in terms of the distinction between the unity of God, who has created everything. So there is a duality, God and his creation, and the notion that since God has created everything emanates from God. So everything is God, and therefore everything is to be loved and respected accordingly. So these are major issues, but Sufis themselves claimed they were following the path of the Prophet in order to know the loving attributes of God. So love for God means loving attributes of God, and to witness God, to experience God, to annihilate themselves in God, which is articulated in terms of the notion of fana, and to come back with the vision of God, the surur and satisfaction of the vision of God, with the notion of baqa. So these are the ideals in terms of the Sufi practices. Fana fillah, baqa billah, and Sufis claimed they were bound to Shariat in doing all this, as the bottom line. Shariat is the bottom line, even if there might be digressions from it in terms of practice from time to time. In terms of a spiritual progress, there is a clarity in all traditions of Sufism with regard to the commitment of Shariat, on the path of Tariqat, for achieving some knowledge, spiritual knowledge, Ma'rifat, and Haqiqat of the Vahdaniyat of God and the existence of it, the foundations of which lie in Quran and traditions of the Prophet. The argument would be with regard to Shariat is that when you are on the path of Tariqat, it is important that one is Sharia bound. If you are not Sharia bound, where will you fall when you fall from the path of Marfat towards Haqiqat, etc.? You fall in Shariat. If you are not bound to Sharia, where will you go? You will go to the deep trenches of hell, is the suggestion and understanding in Sufi traditions. And therefore, Quran and traditions of the Prophet are the basic, theoretical, grounds on which Sufi mysticism is based. And there are different kinds of Sufi traditions. So there might be very, very heretical kind who are not bound to this. There could be Qalandars and Hadris and Jawali, etc. We know what happened to the Qalandars by 18th, 19th century. They were completely subsumed into Dashnami Sannyasi kind of, broader Hindu mysticism. But those who safeguarded, whether they were Sohrawardis and Chishtis and Naqshbandis and Qadris, they remain part of the conformist tradition of Sufism within the fold of Islam. They are not outside the pale of Islam. Barelvi Islam of the 19th century and 20th century is not outside of Islam. Ahmad Raza Khan Barelvi's fatwas, in the late 19th, early 14th, 20th century would be as puritanical as any of the Wahhabi Deobandi kind of fatwas. So they were bound to, and that's why they would call themselves as Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, and claiming that they are not outside the pale of Islam. So who are we or others to give fatwas against them about what is recommended in Islam and what is not recommended in Islam? And since they are not following Islam, Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi anil Munkar, they should be punished for what they are doing. So for my own interest, our own interest here, central to Sufi's interest is love for God and service to humanity. And that is what people are, longing for in the Sufi Khanqahs. They want some spiritual solace. They want some support, whether it is in the form of feeding the poor, in terms of whether organized langar or simply helping feed, the poor people, and this is a very, very important, demand and service, and it is central to the Chishti tradition, as also all traditions of Sufism. Nizamuddin Auliya would say that in the practice in the Jamaat Khana, his Jamaat Khana was in this order, that you come and you say salam, and then you sit, and straight away there will be tam and then kalam. That will be the order: salam, tam, kalam. And the argument is that if you go to a house of a particular person and that person has not even offered you a glass of water, it is like visiting a graveyard where the dead person is not in a condition to offer anything for you to eat. And therefore, emphasis on feeding the poor, feeding guests, feeding visitors. For the Sufi himself and herself, it is about fasting all the time. Such fasting that the bones would be coming out and the flesh would all be going. It would be like a dead stick kind of body, that endures the difficulties, caused by not eating and not eating enough, but feeding the poor. And it is in this context that I'm remembering a very, very interesting anecdote with regard to Rabia Basri, the first generation of Sufi. Rabia Basri, Hassan Basri, Junaid Baghdadi, these were the first generation of the Sufis. Rabia was completely iconoclastic. She was dead against Muslims, common Muslims who were into devotion for God, and the argument was they were devoted to God with reference to this perception that there is a heaven and hell, and it is because of that heaven-hell perception that people were worshipping God. No one was worshipping God for what God itself is supposed to be, and therefore there's one anecdote about how she would be on the roads of Basra. She would be rushing about with a pail bucket of water, and in another some fire, saying that she is going to burn the heaven and set the fire of hell off, because if there is neither Jannat, Jahannam, these people will stop worshipping God. And this was considered to be, her whole entire approach was considered to be completely heretical. So one of the disciples, after her death, sees Rabia Basri in her dream, thinking that she might have been thoroughly punished by God after her death, and inquired about her condition. And Rabia explains that just because she was feeding a stray dog at the door of her house every night, that God has forgiven her for all her idiosyncrasies, all her sins. She was feeding a stray she-dog outside her house in the middle of the night, and at night, and this was enough for her salvation, so to say. And this idea, therefore, of service and feeding, etc., comes from this understanding, which is central to Islam, is that God is supposed to have created everything, and therefore love and respect for all his creations are demanded. Whether these creations are humans or whether they are dogs and other animals and other things, other beings, and this is the recommended ideals, that love for God and love for all his creations. This would mean that the binaries in the society that we create about Muslims and non-Muslims, Hindu and Muslim in our context, or man, woman, or upper caste, lower caste, this creed, that creed, etc., all these binaries collapse in the Sufi idiom and Sufi practices with this notion that everything is a creation of God. Why should we make these distinctions? Did God make a mistake in creating a kafir? And did God make a mistake in creating a woman? That we should not aspire for some kind of equality, some kind of respect and love for people. And all this entails cultivation of the heart, qalb, in such a way that the distinctions and hierarchies and discriminations, inequalities of different kinds should be taken care of. And this should also take care of the difficulties of nafs, So nafs are to be controlled, and purified, and qalb cultivated. And therefore the key terms being tazkiyah nafs and khidmat khalq. These are the two important preoccupations of Sufis that takes care of them as evolved being, and therefore respected for what they are. Now, very quickly, in what follows, I shall offer some highlights on the critical significance of Sufism as an important strand of Islamic traditions in the political cultural history of India for a long time. Around 11th century onwards, as I said, Kashf al-Mahjub, written in Persian, first Persian treatise on mysticism is being written in Lahore in the 11th century. All the way to 18th century, which is where I am stopping, medieval and early modern India. Medieval is broadly for us 11, 12, 13, 14, 15th century. Early modern is 16, 17, 18th century, and 19th century is a colonial modern. 20th, 21st, we are in our modern contemporary times. So looking at a variety of Sufi literature in Persian and Indian vernaculars, the crucial themes include Sufi miracle as a source of authority. Miracle is central. People go to Sufis for miracles. If someone is a saintly person, that saintly person should be known to be performing miracles in the service of the people as an act of benevolence. Sometimes it is Jamal, therefore, but sometimes it could be in the form of Jalal also, that the Jalal or wrathful self of the Sufis have been provoked by an antagonist, and therefore there might be some retribution, but generally it is for the public weal, for the goodness of it. And then music, as I said, as a hotly contested issue, and debate over the possible role of Sufis in the process of conversion to Islam and Islamization more properly as a cultural accretion. Huge population in the subcontinent, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, taken together, has embraced Islam over a long period, roughly beginning around 13th century onwards, 12th, 13th century onwards, to 18th, and now this process, I would assume, of Islamization has continued in the 19th, 20th century to the present. The process of Islamization in the sense of practicing Islam as much as possible with the correct adherence to the teachings of Islam in the light of the Quran and traditions of the Prophet, interpreted by jurists, maybe by scholars, maybe Sufis in this case. So linked to the last set of questions about conversion and Islamization are the larger debate on religious interactions and contestations of the kind that can be seen in medieval period in the Sufi Bhakti complex, medieval and early modern period, 15th, 16th, 17th century. Kabir Sahib, how can we dump Kabir Sahib? Baba Nanak Shah, where do we keep him? Sheikh Abdul Quddus Gangohi, he's a Chishti Sufi scholar. He's writing to Babar about interests to be safeguarded, in terms of the cause of Islam, and his practices could be entirely yogic, and he would claim that there are no contradictions in that. This also means that Sufi and Bhakti scholars should be talking as in the same way as Sufi Bhakti sons were talking in the medieval period, which does not happen. Sufi scholars work on Sufism, Bhakti scholars work on Bhakti. The two hardly meet, and therefore these are two different separate strands of scholarship within the religious history of India of the same period. But when a cultural history of the Indian national kind is written, these are counted. Guru Nanak, Baba Nanak Shah, Kabir. Kabir is a monotheist. Kabir began as a Sufi, and he remains a Sufi of a Wajudi kind. His verses are completely embedded in Wahdatul Wajud, ideas of Wahdatul Wajud, and yet he would be questioning all the hypocrisies which are part of the practices of Islam in many cases. So therefore, I would argue that the larger interactions and contestations are important, which have made communities what they have become in later times. So in this debate carried over several centuries, whereas a number of Sufi masters adopted a conciliatory approach, as Kabir would be doing, as Baba Farid would be doing. Remember, Kabir's verses and Baba Farid's verses are part of the Guru Granth Sahib. So it's a conciliatory approach. Nizamuddin Aulia. Some others struck a hostile position about the place of non-Muslims in a purportedly Islamic regime. And that is very, very clearly, coming out in the activism of, Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi, Mujaddid Al-Fasani, Naqshbandi Sufi in the late 16th, early 17th century. And yet others advocated a more eclectic approach to the resolution of critical issues, as in the case of Shah Waliullah in the 18th century, that minimized the controversy in Islam. This fatwa culture is not good. Stop condemning Hindus. Stop saying women are going to dargahs are to be blocked altogether. And yet maintain some distinction regarding what is recommended in Islam and what is not recommended in Islam. The rulers' political domain, the rulers themselves favored broad humanism of the kind most Sufi lineages and masters invoked in dealing with large non-Muslim population. And that's how they made themselves relevant, and that's how they could make themselves legitimate as rulers. The political ideologies and actions differed or shifted, as can be seen in varying governmental frameworks. We have a framework of Akbar, of a very inclusive kind. At the height of his power, he would be speaking in terms of Sulekul. And then there is a framework also of Aurangzeb, who is now facing difficulty in terms of perception about his rules of discriminatory kind with sections of the population he was supposed to be governing. So the governmental frameworks, in general, Sufi inclusiveness and broad-based political framework were deployed in creating a system that has served the lasting legacy of India's image as a peace-loving country, which could successfully handle its religious and cultural diversity, about which we know that a large subcontinent has so much diversity, and it is yet part of the unified political entity for long times in history. This diversity is cultural diversity is politically protected, politically enabled. And in this the role of the Sufis is very, very important. They would support Iltutmish when the ulama would say that this is Darul Khilafat, this is Hazrat Delhi Sharif. How can Hindus be allowed to do all this dhol baja and singing and dancing, etc.? They should be stopped from it. Or the Sufis, the way Sufis would be guiding, Alauddin Khalji or Muhammad Tughlaq, or even Muhammad Tughlaq would listen to Sufis from time to time, though he would do things according to his own whim, as we know of. And we have examples of Akbar's fascination for devotion for the Chishtis, whether Muinuddin Chishti visiting or whether Salim Chishti at Fatehpur Sikri. So therefore, the Sufis' role in the making of this important feature of India's political and cultural achievement is of crucial import. And therefore, relevance and significance of Sufism as a binding force is important and need to be emphasized from time to time. So quickly, therefore, I would reiterate that Sufism has been an important strand of Islam in South Asia subcontinent historically. It is considered to be the heart of Islam, spirit of Islam, emotional expression of Islam of graceful kind, different from the violent political Islam of the kind we are confronted with from time to time, who go and attack Baba Farid Mazar, Dargah Baba Farid, or Shahbaz Qalandar, or even Dadaganj Bakhsh Ali Hujwari's Dargah, because they are doing something which is about uniting the people, about accepting and accommodating differences, about doing things which may not have been recommended in the 7th century Arabia, and yet these people have appropriated those practices to enhance their spiritual practices. And therefore, we know that a large number of Sufi figures settled across the Indian subcontinent through medieval and early modern eras. Literature related to them has spoken highly about significant political and cultural roles played by them. Rulers invoked popular religion and spirituality for legitimation of their power. And conversely, spiritual leaders also intervened in matters of politics and governance. They were not entirely doing, qata ta'alluq in terms of politics, or complete tarke dunya in terms of, withdrawal from the world entirely. They would intervene. We know Shah Waliullah intervened. We know Sheikh Ahmad Sarandi intervened. We know Nizamuddin Auliya and Baba Farid intervened. Muinuddin Chishti intervened, and these were formidable personalities, scholars of the first order in their times, and respected subsequently also. So therefore, interactions between political and spiritual domains, which are in normal times, are to be separated. Political domains is the domains of the rulers, sultans, badshahs, kings, etc., and the spiritual domain is the domain of the holy men, the Sufis and men of religion, etc. And yet, from time to time, they need to work together to ensure that there is some peace and some welfare for the public. And therefore, interactions between political and spiritual domains have created conditions for general public weal through inclusive political theory and practice, as well as recognition of shared and pluralistic cultural traditions with space for diversity and difference for peaceful coexistence. This is what Sufis have ensured by letting the doors of their khanqahs and dargahs open for large numbers of Muslims, non-Muslims, and practice in whatever way they want to practice and respect and venerate and show their devotion to the person buried there. And therefore, Sufism has contributed immensely to these processes, marking the subcontinent's civilizational achievements with peace and tolerance as defining features, which is politically ensured. Despite various kinds of contestations ranging from violent combats to shrewd negotiations. And there has to be consensus, for peaceful coexistence. And we know this through a whole lot of scholarship that has come up in the last 50, 60, 70 years. Some fine scholarship on Sufism by several accomplished professional historians in these past decades has brought considerable sophistication to the understanding of some of the critical roles that I am talking about with reference to Sufis in the medieval period, whether in North India or in Punjab or Bengal or Deccan or wherever you go, you find, there will be a mazar of a Sufi, a dargah of a Sufi, and there is a relevance of that practice in that context. I'm just remembering the fine works of scholars like Muhammad Habib and Khalid Ahmad Nizami, of Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi, Nurul Hasan. In some sense, they have done a lot to understanding Sufism and their relevance in our context as in their own context of the medieval period in the 13th, 14th century and after. In more recent decades, Richard Eaton and Carl Lance, Bruce Lawrence, they are with their base in the United States, North America, have done tremendous amount of work in terms of our understanding of Sufism in India. These are scholars, these are post-Orientalist scholars in the sense that these are not the scholars who are coming with some agenda for understanding Sufism to demean it, but these are professional historians. They are committed to evidence, historical evidence. They are post-Orientalists. They are not some missionaries who are, and therefore their work has to be respected. In more recent times, Scott Kugel has done some very fine work for Deccan and in Sufism in Deccan, Aurangabad, Hyderabad. As also on this very important question of homoeroticism in Sufi practice. Not so much homosexuality, but homoerotic fascination of the beauty of the creation of God, is in the Chishti tradition. This is Scott Kugel. Niall Green's work on Aurangabad, once again, is very, very important. Miko Vitamaki has work on the Nizamuddin, tradition, Chishti Nizami tradition, especially with regard to his work on Khaja Hasan Nizami, and who was a formidable figure in the early 20th century. And their work has to be and role has to be respected in safeguarding this tradition and talking about it intellectually. Sometimes, seeking political, support as well. And we know political support is forthcoming. All kinds of criminals, politicians, ministers, thugs, bandits, etc., have been devotees of the Sufi shrines, and this is reflected in the chadars which they send to the dargahs on the occasion of the annual Urs celebration. So the biggest of the ministers are sending chadars. Why are they doing this? They understand their significance, relevance in terms of important cultural domain, and therefore to be respected. So these Sufis are Muslim holy men who styled themselves as lovers of God, friends of God. They are often charismatic leaders with popular appeal because they have the charisma, they attract a large number of people. They were organized in silsilas, spiritual lineages or orders, branching into quite a few competing strands. And as I've already mentioned, several of them, Chishtis and Suravardis and Naqshbandis and Qadris and Firdausis and Shattaris, they are all over the subcontinent. Though these spiritual lineages maintain their respective traditions, some Sufi masters have often transcended barriers by joining multiple silsilas. So someone is also part of the Chishti and Suravardi and Chishti and Qadri and Chishti and Naqshbandi maybe, and not remaining tied to one Sufi master. All of these silsilas, spiritual genealogies, trace backward all the way to the time of the Prophet. In many cases, through Hazrat Ali, So all of them trace their lineage backward to the time of the Prophet, mainly connecting with the extraordinary figure of Imam Hazrat Ali. All of them, most of them. There will be some who would be connecting with Abu Bakr Siddiq or Umar Farooq, but most silsilas would be, and therefore there's a lot of respect for the personality of Hazrat Ali in Sufi tradition. This is there in Qawwali, recited, every day, especially on Thursday evenings, as also on the occasion of Urs, the death anniversary, and death anniversary is celebrated as something of the devotee, the Sufi actually going to meet God in death, and therefore that death anniversary is celebrated. And since we have already referred to the controversial practice of music, Nizamuddin Aulia, who was deeply into music, had willed that his burial procession should be taken out with qawwals singing all the songs of love. So Mahfil-e-Sama should continue with the body of Nizamuddin Aulia for in the funeral. But some of the ulama, leading ulama, who were also disciples of Nizamuddin Aulia, took upon themselves to decide that they will not agree with the will of Nizamuddin Aulia on this issue, and therefore this thing was taken care of. It could not become a fitna of sorts. It would have been a very, very controversial statement that he would have made if it were allowed that Mahfil-e-Sama was organized, moving with the body to the grave, to the place where he's buried. The important figures was name keep coming up for the Chishtis are Moinuddin Chishti, Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, Sheikh Fariduddin Ganj Shakar, Nizamuddin Aulia, as also Nasiruddin Chirag Dili. These are the first 5 great Chishtis of the Sultanate period. And in every generation, we find that there are circles of Sufis who are equally important in their own context. And then there will be Chishtis, and there will be Suravardis, and there will be Qadris and Naqshbandis with their lineages going backward to the time of the Prophet. So as I mentioned above, Sufis dedicated themselves to the love of God, which meant love for all his creations, translating into charitable endeavors, blessings and benedictions. the notion of egalitarianism, which is central to Islam in terms of equality of all human beings, which is not actually often practiced. Sufis have shown it can be practiced, but often it was not practiced. Islam, wherever it has gone, it has embedded itself in the local social structure. So therefore, we have in India, among Muslims, Jati Pratha and Zat and Biradri of Ashraf kind and Ajlaf kind and Pasmanda kind, which the Sufis could not handle in terms of doing away with these kinds of hierarchies and stratification, but certainly Sufis practice that egalitarianism. And as I mentioned, service to humanity through feeding, langar or healing, jhar phook, blowing and touching and charms and amulets, taweez. These were considered by some as better forms of worship than ritualistic prayers, and that becomes a controversial statement. But best of the Sufis would say namaz, roza, hajj, zakat. These are foundational. These are faraiz. These cannot be abandoned. Sufis also made a considerable investment in the control of the lower self, as I said, nafs, and cultivation of the heart, qalb, through a variety of meditational come bodily practices and withdrawal from this worldly demands of tarke dunya kind, non-materialistic withdrawal. Even if we live in the world and yet we are maintaining withdrawal from the world would be the Sufi position. And these were to be practiced with the same kind of intensity as the madness of Majnu for Laila. Sufis thought that there was something like in their junoon, for love for God, they would be like Majnu. And yet Sufis considered themselves superior to him, superior to Majnu. For the former, Majnu sacrificed his life for a perishable Laila, whereas Sufis devoted themselves for an eternal God who will be there forever. And in this context, there is an anecdote in Fawaidul Fuwad, which is a collection of the discourses of Nizamuddin Auliya, collected by Amir Hassan Sizzi, who was a poet, who was also in the service of Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad Tughlaq, that when Laila passed away, they rushed to inform Majnu, who was sitting in a graveyard thinking of thoughts about Laila, that how Laila has passed away, and this news of Laila's passing away made Majnu very angry. In the sense that Majnu felt that he was wasting his time for Laila, whereas Laila was going to die. And he thought he was a fool that he wasted his time for a perishable being. And therefore Sufis think they are smarter and intelligent in devoting their times in the love for God, which is an eternal figure. And therefore in an ecstatic love for God, Sufis could also sing and dance. Not so much in a vulgar manner, but in most aesthetically sophisticated forms developed through centuries of practice. And when Sufis passed away, as I said, celebrated as marriage or union with God, Urs, they left behind memories to be cherished forever. And the shared legacy of Sufism coupled with inclusive political practices has shown that it was possible to address the aspirations of a variety of people. Sorry, there was some disturbance with the connection. And therefore, it is important for us to have a quick look into the variety of Sufi literature, on the basis of which we can understand Sufi tradition in all its complexities. And this literature is a vast corpus. The Persian literature, Sufi Persian literature in India itself, through the medieval period itself, is so vast that scholars would be saying that Persian literature on Sufism taken together in Iran and Central Asia and other Persianate world is much less compared to the vast corpus the subcontinent has produced of Sufi literature in Persian. Is such a vast, and there are varieties of genres and forms in which this literature exists. And then we also have the vernaculars. Wherever we go, there are languages. Those languages have literature, and a vast amount of that literature is also Sufi literature. Emerging from around 14, 15, 16, 17, 18th century, Urdu, Hindi. Some examples I will give: time permitting. One of the most important set of Sufi literature are the Malfuzat, or discourses of a Sufi compiled by a disciple, and generally in the lifetime of the Sufi himself and edited by the Sufi himself. So these are not hagiographical literature, these are not legendary literature. This is the literature, coming literally out of the mouth, alfaz, loves, and malfuzat of Sufis heard and recorded by a particular disciple, and then brings that text to the Sufi to show that this is what was talked about in the previous meeting, and the Sufi can edit that. And this is how Fawaidul Fuad and Khairul Majalis, collections of the discourses of Nasiruddin Chiragh Delhi, Khairul Majalis, were compiled. Quite a few other malfuzat. All Sufis would be maintaining malfuzats of their preceptors, and which Nizamuddin Auliya did for Baba Farid, Baba Farid did for Bakhtiar Kaki. So all these Sufis have their discourses compiled often in their own lifetime. And by middle of the 14th century, we have a vast corpus of Sufi literature of Malfuzat kind, in which Sufis are not merely, preaching and discoursing, but these are in the conversational form. Disciples have come, they are sitting here and sitting in the order in which they have come, and there is a conversation going on between the Sufi and the disciples who have congregated there. A large number of maktubat or letters written by Sufis are also available from the 13th, 14th century onwards. There's several references to Nizamuddin Auliya writing letters to Amir Khusro, because Amir Khusro is sometimes in Bengal or in Deccan and different places, Rajputana, and therefore through letters is being trained. But two of the finest collections of compilations of letters that have come down to us from the 14th century are from Bihar. Sharfuddin Yahya Maneri, a Firdausi Sufi of Bihar, his Maktubat Sadi, 100 letters, and Maktubat Do Sadi are well known, and some of these are available in translations also. Father Paul Jackson translated Maktubat Sadi into English. Urdu translations of all these classics also exist. As in the Fawaidul Fuad case, Khaja Sansari Nizami published with Urdu Academy, Persian text with Urdu translation. Two very good translations in English are also available by Ziaul Hasan Farooqi of Jamia, as also Bruce Lawrence in Duke. Two different translations almost simultaneously published. Khairul Majalis is available in Urdu translation. Maktubat I mentioned. There are also mystical treatises on Sufism prepared by a Sufi sheikh, and Sufi tradition was highly intellectual and highly literate, and that is reflected if you look at the texts they have compiled, look at the commentaries of older texts they have written, and look at the texts which are referred to continuously in the Malfuzat. It shows that they were continuously cross-referencing, intertextual kind of conversations between texts and interpretations, making themselves relevant in terms of their ideas, being explicated. And therefore, mystical treatises on Sufism prepared by Sufi Sheikh, I was mentioning about Kashful Majoob of Dataganj Bakhsh is a fine text from the 11th century in Persian, written in Lahore, is significant. And then we have a large number of tazkiras from around middle of the 14th century. Definitely Siyarul Auliya of Amir Khurd Kirmani is a fine text, but for me the finest text is the late 16th, early 17th century Akhbarul Akhyar of Sheikh Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, who was a Sufi of the Qadri order, a scholar of the tradition that goes on through Shah Abdul Rahim, goes on to be led by the family of Shah Waliullah, in the 18th century. As I mentioned, Shah Raziuddin and Abdul Qadir, doing their making scholarly interventions. And then there's a vast corpus of Sufi poetry of love, both in Persian and also in a significant genre in Hindi literature called the Premakhyan. The Premakhyan of the Padmavat kind was in the news for the wrong reasons recently, and this is an important text in itself. Now, some people who read Hindi and are not sure about what Islam is doing, what Muslims are doing, would be surprised to see that how is it that Sufis, despite being Muslims, were writing poetry of love. Whereas the general understanding is Muslims should be talking about hate and violence and terrorism all the time. And these kinds of texts offer a corrective to that kind of misunderstanding regarding what Islam was like in the medieval period and subsequently to the present. Because Sufis would be intervening in politics also, and therefore court chronicles and court histories would also be referring to. And we have a vast corpus of historical literature. Ziauddin Barni's Fatawai Jahandari and Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi are very, very important texts already in the 14th century. And subsequently, as we go forward in the 15th and 16th century, Badayuni's, Muntakhabut Tawarikh offer a very fine understanding of Islam, of the Sunni kind, somewhat traditional, somewhat conservative, struggling against the changes of the early modern kind, Akbar kind, rational kind that was being introduced, and therefore there'll be discussion about what will happen to Sufism. The argument would be that perhaps these Sufi people have started a dukan, they have a dukan in the name of spirituality, and that those dukans are to be shut down. That was very harsh on the part of Akbar to make such a statement. So therefore, we come to know through the samples of Sufi writings through the medieval period that they were very, very relevant, they were very, very significant, and they're very, very important. I just mentioned about the Premakyan genre of Sufi literature. If a communal kind of Hindi Sahitya ka itihas is to be written, this Premakyan has to be completely bypassed. And yet we will run into the Abdul Rahim Khana and a whole lot of other leading intellectuals and scholars and political figures in the 16th, 17th century who have intervened in the literary domain in Hindi. So Premakyan is one, there will be Chandayan, there will be Megavati, there will be Madhumalati, a whole lot of texts which are written by Sufi figures. So Sufi figures in terms of Islam are aware of the entire Arabic tradition. They are also Persianate, and therefore they are available of the Persianate culture. They are working in the Indian environment, and therefore the Indian environments, cultural traditions, literary traditions, indigenous traditions, vernacular traditions are also to be accounted for. And therefore I quickly refer here to the importance of the Hindi field, which has somewhat communalized since the latter half of the 19th century with the Urdu-Hindi divide that we are aware of. And yet some of the finest masterpieces of classical Hindi literature of medieval period have been produced by Muslim writers, and mainly Sufis and other holy men. How do we set them aside altogether to talk in terms of, their irrelevance and say something else altogether? We are aware of the medieval Islamic association with Arabic and Persian languages, and this has justly been recognized in literary and intellectual histories, but the emergence of a vast and fascinating corpus of Indic vernacular literature and its association with Islam has not been adequately appreciated. Punjabi tradition cannot be understood without reading Punjabi Sufi literature. Earliest of the Urdu texts have been written by figures who were associated with Sufi traditions, and therefore, or this is the case, might be in other languages as well. So whereas Islamic theoretical and political discussions could still be accessed in Arabic and Persian, Sufis and other Muslim holy men were being heard already in the 13th, 14th centuries, speaking languages such as Punjabi and Bengali, besides what is now identified as Hindi or Urdu. This old small text by Maulvi Abdul Haq, Urdu ki ibtidai nasho numa mein Sufiya Karam ka Kam is a very important text. It sums up, giving examples of some utterances in the Sufi hospices, where origins of early Urdu literature could be traced. In Gulbarga, Okay, so I am getting message from Professor Zwan that why I should perhaps stop now, and if there are questions that can be taken, and I can respond, possibly. So there are lots to talk about the relevance of Sufism in their context, in our context, always, with all their specificities or all their deviations, if you like, if we are judging them from some yardsticks of Islam or the other. And therefore, my suggestion is with regard to how this tradition of Sufism cannot be abandoned altogether as something which is not Islamic and completely irrelevant and therefore not talked about. The fact that we are commemorating here the memory of Shah Waliullah, who intervened politically and also in the spiritual domain for some course corrections, the fact that the Mughals were declining and therefore there was a need to intervene, the fact that certain practices were not in conformity with the early Islamic traditions and they needed to be intervened. This is what the Sufis were supposed to be doing all along, and therefore, it is important that we know this and we take cognizance of these traditions. The most important thing that they did is to with regard to the breaking of boundaries, of Hindus and Muslims, of man, woman, this caste, that caste, lower class and higher classes, etc., in terms of equality and in terms of respect. And therefore, this is an important tradition, whether with regard to Kabir or Guru Nanak, or whether with regard to Baba Farid or Nizamuddin Aulia. Some details which I still not presented, maybe I will refer to if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful lecture by Professor Raziuddin Aquil. He shed light on his on various traditions of Sufi traditions prevailing in medieval and early modern India, and many of them are still in practice in various khanqahs. So now we have some time for taking some questions from the audience. So I will request you to be brief so that we are able to take 4 or 5 questions, if possible. Yes, Dr. Khurshid Imam.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful and very elucidating lecture. I have a small thing which I would like to explore further is has the Indian Sufism influenced some of the Sufi or mystic traditions outside the boundaries of India? I'm particularly referring to the Jewish mysticism, which has influenced many of the upper class. And in the Indian context, we normally refer to Sheikh Sarmad, about whom some scholars have written that once a Jew, he always remained a Jew, but he has been highly celebrated as a Sufi saint. So I would like to know from you if you have come across, or if you can refer to any article or book, suggest anything of that kind from where I can take off that the Indian Sufi traditions influence outside the Indian geographical territory. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for this question. This is an important question, actually, in the sense that Sufism in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century worldwide is actually Indian Sufism. So from late 18th century, 19th century, 20th century onwards, wherever you go in Europe, in the Middle East, parts of Middle East, you go to Africa, wherever you go, you find that there is an Indian connection to Sufism. So whatever came to subcontinent in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, 17th, 18th century, it evolved. And from the 19th century, when the international networks were opened up, through imperial, and colonial connections, etc., the Sufism that is practiced worldwide today is Indian Sufism. Sometimes it might be condemned as Barelvi Islam or Sunni Islam of the Barelvi kind, etc. But Sufism is actually a worldwide Indian interpretation of Sufism. And then there will be major centers like Hazrat Nizamuddin Dargah in Delhi or Moinuddin Chishti's Dargah in Ajmer are major centers for Sufi devotees, for them to come from all over the world during the period of Urs. In terms of ideas, perhaps there would be, in response to Wahdatul Wujud, there might be this idea of the understanding, cultivation of theoretical exposition of, instead of Wahdatul Wujud, maybe a more acceptable Wahdatul Shuhud would perhaps be, that it is not entirely that man and God are same, but in the experience of a Sufi at a particular time, it is possible that the Sufi is thinking that is witness to God and the beauty and Jamal of and vision of God. So some ideas certainly, and some practices, all these so-called corrupt practices of yogic kinds, and all these ideas of jhar, phuk, and dua, taviz, etc., are worldwide, and there is an Indian connection to it. The most important example that I will give to you of the exporting of Indian Sufi kind of Islam worldwide is the adoption of color green in Islam, the green color in Islam, which is now identified as the color of Islam. It is not the color of the cover of Kaaba. It is not, it is not there in the mosque of the Prophet, except the tomb which was built in the 16th century that will have green. The dominant color in Islam would be in terms of piety would be white, in terms of mourning, etc. For a period there will be perhaps black, and then the colorful expressions of Islamic excellence would be in the gold, in gold and blue, or different kinds of shades of blue and gold, etc. But the green color that has now become part of Islam is Hinduana, is Indian, and it was picked up by Sufis, and picked up by Sufis in their turban. The Sufis were expressing their love for God wearing a green turban, because green is the color of love in Indian tradition, Indian Hindu tradition of the ancient kind. And now, worldwide, pan-Islam, from the 19th century, we see that color green has spread all over. Otherwise, nowhere in the Middle East, you will find that the best of the, in terms of visual culture, best of the architecture, best of the artifacts will not have that kind of preponderance of green, of the kind that is now we see in the pan-Islamic kind of assertions of Muslims in their flags. I do not know enough of prophetic tradition. You people have studied. You will know that green would not be the preponderant color of, in which the prophet would be, expressing himself. It will be multicolored. It will be of very different kinds of shades that would be adopted. So this is completely Hinduana, Indian green, and has been picked up in the pan-Islamic movements from the late 19th century and has become worldwide. And therefore, you will know that green is the color of love, in the sense of green bangles and green saris and green in the Natya Shastra, etc. And this Sufis picked up because they thought that they are in love of God, and they thought that they can wear green on their turban to express themselves as something of a Bharati, or something of actually someone wedded to God. These might sound heretical to people who are thinking in puritanical terms, but this is how it was like. Green is certainly Indian, and it is worldwide now in terms of Islamic association. On any map, there is a Muslim pocket, they will color that pocket with green, that this is Muslim. So where has it come from? It is not Saudi Arabia, or it is it is not Middle Eastern, it is not, it is Indian. And it has spread from Sufism into political Islam of the 19th, 20th century to spread worldwide. And so much that Muslims think that actually Muslim color is green, which is not. Sufi color in their robe for purpose of piety and purity might be white, and Sufi color for their robe for ensuring that the white gets dirty and they're traveling all the time and they don't have water to clean, etc. They would be wearing blue robes. Sufi khirqa will be of blue color. And they would be wearing some woolen, khadar garments, etc., to cover further. From where we get into Sufi, Sufi, the term Suf or Sufi, etc., when we get into the origins of the definition of Sufism. And if at all, from the medieval period, we find green robe, it could be an Indian Sufi figure from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So in the Mughal period, Mughal paintings will find that there is a green robed person and he's a saintly person. He's a Sufi figure. Green is the color of love in Hindu tradition. Green is the color of love in Sufi tradition. Now from Sufism, it has got into Islam and spread worldwide. Is what I should like to think.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, next is Dr. Sayyid Rahman from Alia University, Kolkata. Sayyid Rahman, your question. Unmute.
Okay. Sir, I have 2 points to share with you. You may take it as questions also. That is there any similarity between the philosophy of Wahdatul Wujud, which has been advocated by Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dehlavi in Faisala Wahdatul Wujud, and the philosophy of Advaita of Vedanta philosophy? And second point is there any similarity between Samadhi / Nirvana and the Fana Fillah? If all these spiritual realities are the same, then is there any need of Sharia law, the Islamic Sharia? We can achieve this high status of spirituality following any path.
These are important questions, and I think there's a lot of writings about the acceptance of Wahdatul Wujud in the Indian Chishti tradition, Indian Sufi tradition. I was referring to Abdul Quddus Gangohi in the early 16th century, who wrote a text called Rushdnama, which is translated by Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi as Alakbani, where yes, Abdul Quddus Gangohi styled himself as Alaknath, and with the slogan, slogan of Alak Niranjan. And there, the argument that he is making is that Wahdatul Wujud and Tawheed and Advait kind of Shankara's Advait kind of, there is no difference. There is no difference in these understandings of, and this is there also in Amrit Kund, which was picked up, in a big way in the 15th century, about which Karl Ernst has written in terms of bodily practices, etc. So the argument will be that there are many similarities between non-Muslim mystical traditions and philosophy of Advaita kind on the one hand and Wahdatul Wujud on the other, and at the same time there are distinctions, and therefore the distinctions are Sufis are very much Sharia bound, even if they deviate from time to time in terms of appropriating practices from other traditions. That does not make Sufis go outside the pale of Islam. There are similarities between what Kabir is saying and what Gorakhnath might have said, and what Baba Nanak Shah are saying. So in the spiritual domain, there are languages and ideas which are common to different traditions. Those different traditions go back to their different roots from time to time, when the identity danda is slashed, that whether you are Muslim or not, then you say, we are very much Muslim. Do you perform namaz? Yes. Do you keep fast? Yes. Do you go for Hajj or not? Do you want to pay zakat or not? So all these will make them Muslim. And yet there will be certain things that they will be doing which are similar to other people, other mystical traditions. So there is a common pool of mystical ideas and practices, etc. As I said, Baba Farid performing Chilla Makus, will he be performing namaz of Farz namaz of Fajr or Zuhar or not? and he should be performing, and he is performing, But then there will be other mystical traditions. This is conformist, orthodox, whatever name we give, Naqshbandi and Chishtis. These were Sharia bound. But then there will be Qalandars, there will be Hadris, and there will be Jawalirs, etc. And I was mentioning in passing very quickly that how, since Qalandars had abandoned the Sharia, that they were completely unruly, that they were not bound to, anchored in the Sharia tradition, that they could be easily sold out to ganja and hashish and charas of Dashnami sannyasi, and then they would say Alakh Niranjan, and therefore they will say that there is no difference, which would also mean that the Qalandars will lose their identity as Muslim mystics and become Dashnami sannyasis. And Matthew Clark is a historian who has written an article on this, that how, because Qalandars were actually not bound to Sharia, that they were not anchored in Islam, that they could not protect their identity insofar as they were eventually, finished off by the sannyasis. Where sannyasi practices, many of the sannyasi practices will sound Qalandarana, where their Shahi Asnan, from their Shahi Asnan to all the different kinds of practice would appear Muslim, but they are not Muslims, they're sannyasis, and they have picked up from Qalandars, and they have eaten up the Qalandars also, Now the same thing goes with Samadhi and Nirvana and the notion of Fana and Baqa. So it is possible that many of the ideas Sufis picked up in Khorasan and what is now Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, which was almost entirely Buddhists, in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, and Sufis from the very idea of monastery like khanqahs, big khanqahs which were like monasteries. So many of the ideas and practices could be Buddhist, and yet Sufis are continuously saying that we are following the path of the Prophet. The early Sufi masters were congregated not only in Baghdad and Basra, but also in Makkah, Medina. Ahle Safa at Medina would be the people who had gathered there and who were being trained into Islam, were being offered robes by the Prophet, who were being introduced to Islam, and they were meditating and fasting and just devoted to love of God, just God. They were completely otherworldly. So it is possible that many of the practices of Sufis are common to practices of non-Muslim mystical traditions also, and the language they would pick up in Bengali in Bengal, in Punjabi in Punjab, in North India in Hindi, in Southern India, many of the languages have Sufi literature. So there will be commonality of idioms and commonality of practices, and yet there will be distinctions. This is what the Sufi intellectual position is. But for the laity, for the general public, for the followers, where distinction of Islam and Muslims are not being made, there it is clear that there will be crossing over of boundaries, and there will be appropriations. But the best of the Sufi figures would be conscious of the fact that these appropriations are not in violations of the fundamental practices and beliefs of Islam, so a Sufi who believes in Baqa, Nirvana, and Samadhi does not become a Buddhist monk. The Sufi remains a Sufi, and vice versa.
Thank you.
Next question is by Dr. Ali Raza. Dr. Ali Raza from Kolkata. Yes, Ali Raza, unmute.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving me an opportunity for asking questions.
Question.
Sir, you have mentioned La ilaha illallah Shibli Rasulullah during your speech. My question is that in which sect of Sufism you have found such concept, or it is prevalent?
This is in the this is a controversial statement, and the point is about the blind conformity to Piri-Muridi relationship. Blind conformity to Piri-Muridi relationship to such an extent that the Sufi says that it is day, even though it is night, the disciple will say that yes, it is day. And for everything that the Sufi would be saying, the disciple would be saying yes to that. So to the extent that this is an anecdote actually about a Sufi called Shibli, that Shibli is traveling with one of his disciples. During the course of the travel, they come across a river. That river is to be crossed. Now the river, they don't have a boat. They have to walk over the water. And in Sufi understanding of miracles, it is possible that the Sufi can fly in the air or walk on water, or water can be just, dried up, and they can just, cross over. So there is an anecdote about how Shibli is traveling with one of his disciples, and when they reach the bank of the river, they have to walk on the water. The Shibli would be saying that to the disciple, you don't need to worry, you just follow me and say La ilaha illallah, Shibli Rasulullah. So they start walking on water. Halfway through, the disciple at the back realizes that Shibli himself is saying La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So why should I be saying such an heretical thing as Shibli Rasulullah? So he would also then recite La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. As soon as he does that, he just sinks in the water. So then Shibli turns back and saying that you should just follow what I am saying rather than applying your own mind in this matter. So then he's picked up again and starts saying Shibli Rasulullah and walks away to the other side of the river. This is an anecdote to reinforce this point that the blind conformity of murid is required for the murid to follow the dictats of the Sufi Pir. This cannot be a historical thing, and this cannot be a theological thing. This is, if it actually happens, it is a heretical thing. This is outside the pale of Islam. This is not Islam. But this is Sufi Pir and Piri-Muridi relationship, demanding that kind of conformity. Instead of Muhammad Rasulullah, Shibli Rasulullah, which is not acceptable.
Okay. So since we have to finish in 10 minutes, so we are going to take the last question from Professor Raziuddin Rahman.
Yes, you muted me forever. Yes, I'm trying to unmute myself.
Muted me forever.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Raziuddin. The lecture was truly Aquilian or Razian, whatever should I say? Because Aquilian.
Okay.
Last 25 years, I know you and we have been knowing you. So it was truly scholarly and immersed in the Sufian thought. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I think the point that I'm going to raise here, and you have already touched upon, and you have replied to, that is aside from the additions, innovations, and improvisations that the Sufi leaders have made in their practices, including Muinuddin Chishti, Nizamuddin Awliya, and the other stalwarts of Sufi sects and orders, they are reported. And I emphasize the word reported, because there are reports, even contradictory reports, and how these reports have been compiled and by whom. So they are reported to be, as we have been told by our own scholars, that they have been the strict adherents of the Sunnah of the Prophet, even in matters not really falling in the domain of Farz, Wajib, and even Sunnah. Like we know that there is a Sunnat Muakkada, Sunnat Ghair Muakkada. So they are reputed to be strictly following even Sunnat Ghair Muakkada in matters of miswak, for example, which is not Sunnat Muakkada. So things like that. So they were strictly following the Sunnah. So how to explain the contradiction in their brand of Islam and what is the brand that is in the popular domain, and what is flowing from the Quran and Sunnah, which the Salaf is, and even large chunk of the global Muslim contemplation emphasized as the true and only interpretation of Islam. I hope you got my point. It was somewhat scattered. So this contradiction, how to explain that? Because we have been told that they have been the followers of Sunnah in the first place. And to such an extent that, they would, as you said, that they would do roza, fast. In fact, starving themselves. So if such was there in deep involvement with the prophetic tradition, how was it that, they are reported to be so deviating from the path of the prophet?
No, as far as these big names we keep referring to, Shah Waliullah, going backward in time, Shah Waliullah, Sheikh Masarandi, Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlevi, his uncle, Sheikh Rizqullah Mushtaqi, a whole lot of previous generations of Sufis, the entire Chishti tradition, they were completely conformist to prophetic traditions and traditions, recognized in classical Islam of the mainly Sunni tradition, and yet at the same time, lots of respect for the Ahl Bayt, and with that, respect for Hazrat Ali and all. So in terms of their own practice, there is always a complete adherence. I was mentioning about this path of Shariat and Tariqat and Marfat and Haqiqat. This is a statement by Nizamuddin Auliya in Fawaidul Fuad that Shariat has to be safeguarded in all conditions. That if you fall on the way of Tariqat, you fall into Shariat. And if you abandon Shariat, where are you going to go? Is the statement of Nizamuddin Auliya. You go to Jahannam straight away, is the suggestion. So they are completely, committed to, in terms of safeguarding their and commitment and practice according to what will be the dictats in Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat. The foundational principles, as I said, and foundational texts, Quran and tradition. You see, if you look at Fawaidul Fuad, almost every discussion, you'll find that there is a reference to Quran, there is a reference to traditions of the Prophet, there is a reference to the Khulafai Rashidin. Many discussions are with regard to Hazrat Ali. So they are completely Sharia bound. The practices of prostration, practices of different kinds, which are going on in the Sufi dargahs, etc., are a different thing. And they see no contradiction in what they themselves believe in and practice, and what the general public, devotees and followers are doing at the shrine. There are if you read Khaja Hasan Nizami or Khaja Hasan Sani Nizami's defense of Sufi practices, etc., it is very clear that they are deeply rooted in the prophetic tradition. And yet some of the practices are practices, as I said, not in control of the Sufis themselves, practices which have been evolved. A Hindu public is coming, large numbers in Urs, and they're doing their own prostration before the Mazar. How are they going to be checked and controlled? So certainly there are ambiguities. That's why I mentioned there are ambiguities and there are contradictions in what they're claiming and what is being practiced in khanqahs and dargahs, etc. Certainly there are ambiguities in Indian environment or in wherever they go. The local practices have been accretion. They have been adopted and appropriated. This does not make these mainstream Sufi traditions any less Muslim than any other person who is giving fatwas with regard to reform. Reform of the kind that we know beginning in the 14th century. And 16th, 17th, 18th century, continuously we see that there are fatwas against the beliefs and practices of the Sufis, but Sufis also have thrown up their own scholars, etc. So if you see works, and they are in Arabic mostly, of Shah Waliullah, his qualification and defense of Sufi practices, cannot be ignored altogether to claim that this is not Islamic, and therefore we have to abandon them. Because he belonged to a very learned family, Shah Abdul Rahim, and they were going to Bakhtiyar Kaki's mazar and doing everything. They were connecting themselves to the person who is buried there. Sheikh Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, Khaja Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki is buried at Mehrauli, and you go. Shah Waliullah would go and Shah Abdul Rahim would go and sit there and connect themselves from their heart to the person who is buried there to soak into the blessings accruing from from that connection. So there are many things we know that, I mean, not speaking in crude terms of Wahhabi kind of, or beginning from Ibn Taymiyyah kind of reformism, but there are continuously checks and balances within the Sufi tradition also, with regard to what is permissible and what is not permissible. So texts like Fawazul Fuad or Akhbarul Akhyar in the late 16th century would enable us to think that what they were doing was part of the greater tradition of Islam and not outside of it. Many of the practices, as I said, are Hinduana, mushrikana, whatever innovations, bid'ats, etc., that we often talk about. And yet, they would be saying, in terms of healing practices, they would say Tibbe Nabawi, and prophetic medicine and prophetic practices. For everything that they would be doing, saying, they would refer to, and perhaps, and they were learned people. It's not that they were completely jahil. Jahil public would not be taken seriously beyond a point, but they have left a huge corpus of literature in Arabic and Persian and Turkish and in Indian languages. We cannot, abandon them altogether to say कि ये सब जाहिल लोग हैं या ये मुसलमान नहीं हैं, ये बिदती हैं, ऐसा कह के नहीं कर सकते. We know about Ahmad Raza Khan Barelvi. He was a qualified alim, and his scholarship is formidable, and this commitment to Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat on his part is much stronger than any other strands of scholarship in the 19th century. And yet, the practices of the Dargah and the Khanqahs and this Piri Muridi kind of blind conformity, etc., would be creating a difficulty. And in terms of eclecticism, the Sufis were eclectic. They would be crossing over boundaries. In the Shia Sunni case, Shia Sunni, Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi would be issuing a fatwa to the effect that these Shias are Rafzis and Kafirs, and there will be a whole text called Radd al-Rawafis. And then Shah Waliullah would be saying that this is completely demeaning to the population, to a large population, Shia Muslims, to be condemned as Rafizis. And then the Sunni Muslims are going to them saying, issue a fatwa against Shias, and he would deny that, and he would not agree. So there are many strands, there are many positions. There is no one position in Islam as we know, but not any one of the Chishti, Sohrawardi, Qalandas are different thing. As I said, they become sannyasis, for ganja and charas and hashish, etc. But this tradition of the Naqshbandis and the Qadris and the and Sohrawardis, Chishtis, they were part of the greater tradition of Islam and with a strong commitment to Quran and traditions of the Prophet. When it came to actually taking a Hanafi position or a Shafi'i position or a Maliki position, juridical position, or Jafri position, Shafi, they would be then taking a position which is something like the ghair muqallid kind of position, and that's why on this question of permissibility of music in Sufi tradition, the statement that Nizamuddin Auliya gave to the effect to the ulama who is saying that the Hanafi Islam, Qawli Abi Hanifa, according to a statement of Imam Abu Hanifa, whom we follow, music is haram. How can you justify music, qawwali, sama, with women participating, with mazamir, instruments also included? How can you justify in the light of the interpretation of Islam by Imam Abu Hanifa? So his argument will be that, but we are followers of the Prophet, and Prophet has not said anything against music of the kind that I'm doing. He would say, I am against instruments. He would also say that in Mahfil Sama, it will be male, adult, intelligent, baligh, aqil, not aqilian, but aqil and baligh, male, should be participating in Mahfil Sama of mature persons who have zawq for music and emotional expressions, attached with love for God, etc., etc. But we also at the same time, Amir Khusro is supposed to have invented a large number of and improvised a large number of instruments, and as also ragas and surs and taranas, etc. And Nizamuddin Auliya said, but no, instruments are not allowed. Then we also know women were participating in, as they would visit the Khanqa and Jamaat Khana.
Okay. Thank you.
Shukran.
Thank you. Now may I request the chair of the session to give his presidential remark.
Thank you, Professor Rizwanur Rahman. Am I audible?
जी जी थोड़ा डिस्टर्बेंस है.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, Chairperson, Professor Rizwanur Rahman, learned speaker of the day, Professor Raziuddin Aquil, dear colleagues, friends, students, ladies and gentlemen. The best thing I realized today is the range of Arabic center in JNU, which appears to be too vast. Frankly speaking, it involves not only language, literature, and culture, but also dialogue of civilizations, ilm kalam, mantiq, falsafa, hadith, tafsir, fiqh, jurisprudence, nizam, and of course, spiritual discourses. And as a matter of fact, yet I have to explore where falls man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. Love for God and service to humanity vis-a-vis Sufi traditions is another dimension of such range for which our learned speaker has very successfully deliberated upon. So definitely on behalf of this Center for Arabic and African Studies and my own behalf, I extend gratitude for delivering such a meaningful lecture this morning. And there are, I mean, you know, diversities and differences, and it should happen. But somewhat, you see, I fully agree with Professor Aquil that there is hardly any difference between Wajud and Shuhud as far as devotional practices are concerned. You know, as Mirza Ghalib himself has suggested that Asle Shuhud o Shahid o Mashhud ek hai, हैरान हूं फिर मुशाहदा है किस हिसाब में. But many people beg to differ also. And very pertinent question was asked by Dr. Khurshid Imam. But one can refer it to, you know, the kind of debate we have on Divine Comedy of Dante. And Sayyid Hussain Nasr, in his well-known book Sufi Essays, has described, you know, the relationship between Indo-Iranian mysticism with Christian and Jewish mysticism, and also covered a wide range of Vedanta, etc. Explaining the shortcomings and virtues, particularly this was the subject, basically what I gather, a very, very difficult subject. It's not an easy task, but the speaker indeed made it easy through his fruitful discourse and befitting to the 7th Shah Waliullah Memorial Lecture. Friends, as you know, in the modern setup of human society, the aims and objectives of life change and also differ from nation to nation, man to man, individual to individual, group to group, society to society. And in spite of various obligations and impositions, the speaker already talked about, every now and then ideas are expressed according to individuals' own taste and choice. And accordingly, actions and deeds based upon one's own choice, taste, and temperament, and also ideals, lead to diversities and differences. And this is very good. Such diversities and differences in our society of human beings, it's not new. It's as old as the surface of Earth began to multiply with its inhabitants. And as the population increased and the number of sons and daughters of Adam and Eve shot up, the differences between the human society also gradually enhanced. and in many ways in so many directions. And such is religion, worldly gains, conduct, behavior, moralities, ideologies, and knowledge. Sufism in itself is highly debated topic and very entangled branch of knowledge. And as you know, this is entirely an spiritual activity. It is a state of mind, a mood, a temper, rather than a systematic philosophy of life. Then it is not an opinion. It is not a philosophy. It has nothing in common with the pursuit of occult knowledge. It is not merely the power of contemplating eternity. Indeed, it is the name of that organic process which involves the perfect consummation of love of God. It is the art of establishing man's conscious relationship with the Absolute. It is the spirit of communion between the individual soul and the eternal soul. And Rumi has very well said, it's a march from inferior to the superior degree. And therefore, he talks about the process of evolution, total evolution. As jamadi murdamun nami shudam, was numa murdam be hayvan barzana. And then, you see, there is sayre takamul, the road for completion. And therefore, Ibn Arabi also, Mujaddida al-Fasani also, both of them have described, you see, the ishq, the kind of ishq, maddi, ruhani, and ilahi. You see, there are stages. And Mantiq al-Tair, you see, of Fariduddin Attar, what Attar has said, 7 valleys, after crossing 7 valleys, then there is, you see, realization. The sense of realization is important. And how the 30 birds, Seymour, say they realize they are sitting in the chamber lane of Seymour and then waiting for the arrival of Seymour. But then the realization comes, you see, and they notice that, look, these 30 birds they are the value of Aham Brahmas. So anyway, once again, I congratulate Professor Aquil for such a dialogue. I mean, naturally, see, there are many questions. And these questions will remain unresolved. But yes, of course, you see, there is a deliberation. And you know, Rumi very clearly says that har kisi ya zanne khud shud yare man. Because durune man na just tasrare. Everybody is becoming friendly with me. Nobody is looking deep down to my feelings, my bones, what exactly is happening there. This is a wonderful topic of discussion, and once again, see, I congratulate the speaker, and of course the audience, their understanding, their questions, see the way they question, but somehow keep in mind that the speaker reminded again and again about the diversities and differences. Let us keep it intact. As long as the diversities are intact, we would be able to achieve our target in some way or other. This is not the end of the road. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I also thank the speaker and the people who participated in this memorial lecture. And a special thank is for Dr. Now I request Dr. Sarnekas to formally propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible? Okay. Good noon, everyone. It has been a very interesting, informative, and interactive session. So, on behalf of Center of Arabic and African Studies, I feel immense pleasure to take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to our eminent speaker, Professor Raziuddin Aquil sir from University of Delhi, for his precious time to grace this occasion with his beautiful address for sharing his thoughts and ideas about the topic. Thanks again, sir, for a truly outstanding presentation. Now, my heartfelt thanks goes out to Professor Anur Hassan sir, Dean of the School of Languages, for chairing this session and for sharing his valuable ideas and remarks with us. Thank you, sir. My sincere gratitude also goes to our chairperson, Professor Raziuddin Rahman sir, and all the colleagues, and especially to Dr. Sonu Saini for being with us and for his technical support to conduct this lecture flawlessly, and for helping us to webcast our program on different social platforms. My deep sense of appreciation and thanks to all the dignitaries from JNU and from different universities of India who chose to be live with us and attended this lecture with great enthusiasm and made it a successful event. And definitely, I also thank to our all students who joined with us. Once again, I thank you all for being with us in this memorial lecture. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you, sir.
Rizwan sir, we can't hear you.
Rizwan sir, please unmute your mic.
Hello.
I think there is a technical problem.
Razi Saab. Can't see the speaker in the list.
Khurshid sir, or
Yeah, can we end it up? We can end the session. We can end the session, I think.
सब लोग लॉग आउट कर लें, इसलिए कंट्रोल हमारे पास नहीं है.
Hello. Yes. Since 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 a public platform, I will not say this. Maybe in the faculty group, I will say. It's about the lunch that we do after every Waliullah lecture.
Professor Rahman, with your permission, can we end the meeting?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much.